Okay, here we have Jan Kleijssen, who's joined the Council of Europe in 1983 as a lawyer with the European Commission of Human Rights. Subsequently, he served in the Parliamentary Assembly and as director of the Secretary General's private office. He is currently director of the Information Society Action Against Crime. His directorate carries out standard-setting, monitoring, and cooperation activities on freedom of expression, data protection, artificial intelligence, internet governance, cybercrime, terrorism, criminal fighting corruption, and money laundering. And besides his mother tongue Dutch, Jan is fully fluent in English, French, German, and Italian. So very accomplished man. And here we also have Divya Siddarth. She's the co-founder of the Collective Intelligence Project, which advances collective intelligence capabilities for the democratic and effective governance of transformative technologies. And she's the associate political economist and social technologist at Microsoft's Office of the CTO, and also holds positions as a research director at MetaGov and at the Radical Exchange Foundation. And lastly, on the left, we have Emma Bluemke, who is the research manager at GovAI, where she is responsible for helping researchers conduct and disseminate their research effectively. She holds a background in medical physics, privacy-preserving technologies, and machine learning applications for medical imaging, and holds a PhD in biomedical engineering from the University of Oxford, focused on mathematical modeling of MRI physics. So thank you very much for all being here today. And now I'm going to ask if Jan, could you just give a few remarks about what your background is and anything you'd like to tell the audience before we get into a discussion? Oh, excuse me. Sorry, Jan, you're muted. Just a second.
Even after 200,000 Zoom meetings, one still gets after coffee hasn't hit my brain yet. So sorry for that. Sorry not to be with you in person, but I hope the sound is all right.
Yes.
And that you can hear me. So I'm happy technology makes it possible for me to participate in this exciting event. A few words perhaps about the Council of Europe. You've said more than enough, I think, about me, and if anyone would like to connect on LinkedIn or on Twitter, I'd be very, very happy, of course. On the Council of Europe, often confused with the European Union, but in fact a totally different organization, founded in 1949, following an initiative interacted notably by Sir Winston Churchill, and I think it's perhaps very appropriate that this Remembrance Day weekend we'll have the opportunity to speak about human rights and AI. The Council of Europe was very much established as a reaction to the horrors of World War II, to protect human rights, defend the rule of law, promote and protect democracy. So that's the holy trinity, if you like, of the Council of Europe. Initially, it had 10 member states in 1949, which grew until 47 at the beginning of this year, following Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The Council of Europe was the first, and I think so far the only international organization to draw consequences from that aggression. The Russian Federation was suspended within days and fully expelled from the Council of Europe within 3 weeks. So we're now 46 members, so a lot bigger than the European Union, and the UK, of course, was and remains a member of the Council of Europe. Towards how we go about protecting human rights, rule of law and democracy, through legal cooperation, notably in the form of treaties, binding treaties. We have over 200, what we call multilateral treaties, so treaties binding a lot of different states. The best known, no doubt, is the European Convention on Human Rights, with the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. That convention, though, is open only to member states. And that was established at the very beginning of the Council of Europe's foundation. The recent conventions, and I'll say more about that later, are all open to non-member states. We've dealt with new developments in technology from a very early start. 40 years ago, the Council of Europe established the world's first treaty on data protection. And that came at a time when virtually no country in the world had any data protection legislation. And the convention shaped data protection legislation, not only in Europe, but really well beyond. And the particular treaty, Convention 108, that was established more than 40 years ago, has now parties on virtually every continent. We did the same with cybercrime 20 years ago, and that treaty was recently joined by Nigeria, just to give you an idea of the geographical scope. That treaty has 67 state parties now, and last year the Council of Europe worked in more than 130 countries worldwide. Why I'm saying that all this in the context of AI, two messages. One, we feel strongly that technology, with all the fantastic benefits it can bring, can also pose risks to human rights, rule of law, and the democratic process, and it is therefore good to have a number of safeguards. Second, when establishing such safeguards, we really think well beyond Europe. And as I mentioned, the two treaties on data protection and cybercrime, which have really become global benchmarks. We now aim, and I'll stop there, to do the same with artificial intelligence. We are negotiating a convention, which we hope will be a global treaty. We have to finish it by November next year, so very short deadline. And we hope it will be an important element in ensuring that the design application of AI will indeed promote human rights and rule of law, democracy, and not hinder them. This by way of introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. Now to Divya.
Hello, I'm Divya, and yeah, I think coming off of what Jan was saying, a lot of my focus is around what does it look like to democratically govern transformative technology? And I think there are a lot of ways in which it seems difficult to do this because technology is complex, it's fast moving, it requires a lot of capital input, only certain organizations can build it. All of these kinds of things make it difficult to imagine the combination of democracy as we currently understand it and transformative technology, right? And in a lot of different spaces over my work, I've looked at this on the security side when I was at Stanford, on the sort of centralized public provision side when I was working in India, on the data governance side more recently. All of these kinds of technologies feel very difficult to have any collective input over. They're difficult to understand, and they're very scalable, and they're built by some organizations that are multinational, which often means, other than the excellent work that Jan and other global institutions are doing, it's difficult for nation states to govern them in the interest of everyone in the globe, right? And so now with the Collective Intelligence Project, and my co-founder Saffron is here, which is great, a lot of what we look at is, can we use transformative technologies themselves to enable more democratic governance? Can we scale the way that people provide input into these platforms? Can we build new institutional structures for funding such that, you know, AI companies have public input in them, have auditing functionality, and all of these different kinds of things? And the purpose of that is we're building technology that affects all of us, and we don't have ways for all of us to have a voice in that. And often when we talk about democratizing tech, it looks like saying, can a bunch of people use it, right? And that's only the beginning of what democracy means. That's not what all of our institutions that are democratic are set up to do. They're set up to make sure that if something is democratized, you have voice over it and it works in the collective interest. And right now, that step is not taken with a lot of our technologies. They may work in the collective interest or they may not. And we don't really have a way to make sure that they do. And so a lot of our work is, can we build the institutions, the technologies themselves, and work with the companies that are building tech to have more public oversight such that we move tech in this direction.
Thanks. Just to build, so I'm at Center for the Governance of AI, and we're a nonprofit in Oxford, and we're a research nonprofit. So we have people looking at a huge range of questions. And to build off the first panel this morning, there was a lot of discussion about having people from other disciplines working in these areas, working on AI. And interestingly, I'm the only engineer at GovAI, I think. So we're actually from the other end where it's historians, international relations, policymakers, people with a legal background. There's really a huge range, political science, because these are all questions, these are all really important areas that have already solved a lot of these problems for other case studies, right? I mean, AI is a new technology. However, we have figured out various systems to basically mitigate risk from other areas like aerospace, like air travel. We do manage to do that in a very safe way now, you know, after a lot of time and a lot of regulation on that area and a lot of like safeguarding. You know, you can think there's even places where we have technical standards in place. So I can plug my computer into that outlet, and we know that I'm not going to burn this building down accidentally. So we have figured these things out previously, and people do have that experience. And we can, if you're a historian, you can look at previous case studies for that. So yeah, if you are from those disciplines and you're interested in working in AI and solving these problems that we just discussed, talk to me. But yeah, to build on what Divya said, a huge question right now that is in the news and that we're dealing with is if we have these large models like Stable Diffusion, you guys have probably seen some of the generation algorithms. There is a call to, okay, to democratize it, does that mean releasing the entire model out, like the actual weights to be released and used by anybody? Is that actually democratic? Or actually what we want is us to be able to scrutinize it, or us to be able to scrutinize the recommender systems that are applied to us daily, that are affecting our lives and our feeds and things like that. So I think, again, when we talk about public and private responsibility, and democratizing AI, I think we really need to narrow it down to: are we talking about being able to actually have a say in scrutinizing those models and choosing what is affecting us, or is it the ability to profit off of it and use it? I think these are all completely different things, and we have different legal and technological solutions for each of those.
That's really interesting. Speaking of looking towards the future of what we should do, I want to look back in the past, or just examples today. What are some commendable examples or insufficient examples of AI regulation that we can see?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned you had a really good example of an insufficient example. Oh, muted.
I'll get it right by the end of the conference. I'll get it right. Thank you. Yes, indeed, and a sad example, unfortunately related to my own country. I mean, I work in Strasbourg for the Council of Europe, but I'm a Dutch citizen, as you would have guessed from my accent and my name. And unfortunately, there is a very sad case, a tragedy which occurred, more than a sad case, actually a national tragedy occurred in the Netherlands over the past few years. I'll try to wrap it up as quickly as I can, but the tax authorities, in order to fight fraud with regard to childcare benefits, child benefits, decided to use an AI system. And the idea was, of course, that this would be objective, efficient, and would help them to find those who fraudulently abuse the system. It turned out to be a total disaster. 26,000 families, more than 40,000 people, were wrongly identified on the basis of a wrong AI system without proper governance, which used the wrong data sets and took all sorts of totally irrelevant factors into account, were branded as criminals, all of them from a migrant background, all of them living in particular parts of towns, of the cities in the Netherlands. A number of them, were then forced to pay back benefits they had received over years in a ridiculously short time. A number of these people committed suicide. Many livelihoods were destroyed. 1,600 children were taken away from their families and have still not been reunited with the families. There were court cases, but the judges felt not qualified to challenge the decisions that the automated system had come up with, in the sense of the computer said it was okay, so who are we? So a real issue of effective oversight, judicial oversight. The president of the highest administrative tribunal in the Netherlands publicly apologized on television for miscarriage of justice. The government resigned. There were new elections as a result of this. The parliamentary inquiry issued a report with the title Unprecedented Injustice. And as I said, we're still feeling the consequences. The families still have not been compensated. Of course, the lives lost can never be repaired. The 1,600 children have still not been returned to their families because, meanwhile, they've been with foster families for a while. So you can imagine all the misery that is causing. And I think the lessons to be drawn, and I'm obviously giving you a very short summary. There are lots of factors, but I mean, I'm trying to really condense it for the purposes of our discussion today. I think the important lesson is that AI can, of course, and I think we all agree, many of your engineers, can bring fantastic opportunities, bring progress, but it's a technology, and You rightly mentioned aviation industry, car industry. I would also add perhaps the pharmaceutical industry, which can be all highly innovative, bring fantastic benefits, but also require regulation and governance. And that was sadly lacking in the Netherlands. Of course, lessons have been drawn from this now, hopefully. And what we're working on with the Council of Europe is to have a treaty that will, under which governments will commit to ticking a whole series of boxes to make sure that when public authorities use artificial intelligence, that the data sets are checked, that the systems are supervised, not only with a human in the loop, but with a competent human in the loop, so trained people in the loop. And that also very much applies to, of course, on the one hand, the civil servants, if it's used by the government, but also properly trained judges, so that the judiciary, when there are claims, is in a position to challenge and to examine what a system comes up with. That people should be informed when they're dealing with artificial intelligence, and the call to industry, which has a seat at the table at the Council of Europe. We are negotiating with 52 states, or 46, plus the United States, Canada, Mexico, Japan, the Holy See, and 27 companies which have signed a digital partnership with our organization and which are at the table. Also, regulators, IEEE, for instance, I think well known to many of you, has a seat at the table to ensure that the tragedy that occurred in my country will not be repeated. For those of you who would like to read it up, you will find the Dutch Parliament made a request to the Council of Europe for advice on how to draw lessons from this and how to improve the system. That opinion, it's called, the body that issued that opinion is called the Venice Commission, because that's where it was originally established. The Venice Commission's report, you can find it on the Council of Europe website. It was released in October 2021. And what it said, and I think that's very relevant for our discussion, and again, I'll stop here, is that what happened in the Netherlands could very easily happen elsewhere as well. It could very easily happen as well, and it's perhaps even happening as we speak. So hence the urgency, and hence our determination to at least do our utmost to have a treaty with these basic tenets, with these basic requirements in place already by, at least ready for the governments to sign by November next year, so in a year's time.
Wow, it's very fast.
Yeah, I think this points to this. There is insufficient regulation, but as Jan was saying, there's also insufficient governance, which is an even broader space than regulation, because as Emma and Jan brought up, there are these industries that do need to be regulated. Harms need to be curbed. We need to understand, right? Let's not develop drugs that are exceptionally dangerous. Let's not put dangerous chemicals into baby toys. All of these kinds of things are obviously required from a regulatory perspective. But on top of that, we need an ecosystem that is of governance, that includes standard setting organizations, that includes auditing, that includes understanding the data that goes into things. And not all of those can be regulatory. And in fact, the regulation is in some senses only the first step to determining whether we're actually building a technology that's directed towards the common good, which is the goal, right? And I think sometimes we lose sight of that governance layer, even on top of the regulation layer, which is necessary to direct, not just curb harms. And of course, regulation can do some of that directing. But as Jan was saying, we need standards, we need agreements between organizations, we need the private sector involved in all of these kinds of things. We need oversight that extends beyond what regulation can do. So I think what a lot of our work is around is, can we ensure that we have the baseline, but can we also do better than the baseline, right? To make sure that we're actively directing this towards progress and things that are broadly shared between all of us.
Interesting. Is there like an ideal sort of governance that, like specific things that people could, or governments could use in practice that you've been researching?
It's an open question. It's something that people are working on. Right. And as I said before, there are just a lot of successful case studies from previous technologies, previous industries. There are a lot of very risk-averse industries, and whether it comes in the form of a technical standard or a governance structure, maybe perhaps like a board structure. There's all whether it's corporate governance or putting in regulations. Or auditing, external auditing and external scrutiny is a big a topic of conversation. These are all. I really don't think you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Things have been figured out in other areas. I think it's just there will be bits and pieces that work for this particular technology, especially because things are changing so fast. I mean, I don't know where you are in your schooling at the moment, but I remember when I started my PhD to finish my PhD, the progress of these algorithms really, I didn't think we would hit it for another 10 years. I was really shocked at the end of my PhD about what we could actually generate in the image space, because that's where I was. So yeah, I think a big consideration is to make sure that whatever, especially because it takes a little while to get regulation right, or whatever policy you're proposing, make sure that it's a bit future-proof. Make sure that if the algorithms change or the technology that we're using, let's say you made it really specific to an architecture that we used 5 years ago, and now we've moved on to a completely different architecture for the algorithm. Well, you have to think about those things, right? We don't know exactly what things will look like in 5 years. It's moving very quickly. So yeah, it's a completely open question. But yeah, it's a very important one, and I think actually on that note, I think my gut reaction with Jan's story is you think, oh man, it pulls you towards a really heavy-handed approach, right? Where you think, let's clamp down and make sure these algorithms can't be used for various things. But on our point of democracy and access, there is a risk that if we do that, then you have 3 companies who are allowed to use these technologies and no one else, right? So I think all of these things have to be considered. Yeah.
I think that's a great point around the ideal is adaptation in a lot of senses, right?
Yeah.
That we know we can't build an ideal, which means that one of the most important things we can do is build a structure that isn't rigid and one that can adapt to circumstances, given that things are changing so quickly. And yet, given that regulation is absolutely crucial, how do you balance that, right? Because you need regulation, you have to prevent these tragedies. And at the same time, the technology is changing quickly and you're not going to be able to anticipate every way that it's used in the future. And I think this is what brings me back to democracy at the end of the day, because I think at its best, this is a system that is intended to be adaptive, right? Getting input from a lot of places, and markets are adaptive in a similar way. It's an information gathering process, and to adapt, you need ways that, not only is there top-down information architecture, but there's also bottom-up, because there's no ideal, because the ideal is so difficult. And one example that we look at a lot is internet governance. And I think, even with the panel earlier, is this a space that's going perfectly? Absolutely not. But I think it's very different from some of the other ones we've been talking about because of the speed of the technology change and the way that it combines like an infrastructure layer, right? There has to be regulation and standards over the fiber optic cables that run under the ocean, all the way to the servers, to the standards, to the protocols like TCP/IP and HTTPS that allow for packets to be distributed to your computers, to allow a bunch of companies to make money off of it, to make sure that some things you can't make money off of, to enable security. Cybersecurity is all built on internet standards. Jan brought up IEEE. There's also the W3C, IETF. Like, so many organizations come together to make it possible for people all over the world to access the internet. And it's kind of amazing that that works at all, right? And I think it's this good example because it's not perfect, because it hasn't prevented shutdowns in a lot of places. It hasn't prevented definitely massively unequal, access to a lot of different things. And yet it has built an edifice of fast-moving technology that has private and public input that does work. And I think those models are helpful because they're built on adaptation, and yet they could be much more democratic. So they give us an anchor and a path forward in terms of looking at something like AI.
One thing I'm curious, if just by show of hands, how many of you are currently using AI in your research or building algorithms? What's sort of the numbers? So, okay, so, and you might be doing, large models, I'm not sure, but perhaps you're just doing something for like a tiny medical purpose, right? Like maybe you're doing some sort of like disease diagnostic tool. One thing that's really important to ensure is that your research is not stifled by some regulation that comes in that's actually intended to regulate a larger company, right? We can, and I think there are examples of this, right? If you think about driver's licenses, right? Like everyone can use a bicycle on the road. We've kind of decided as a society that that's okay. And then going beyond that, if you're driving a certain size of car or a car beyond that, and then, very few of us could ever own or use a Boeing or fly like one of those mega Boeing jets, right? So, but at the same time, I can still go and pay and get on one and use it. So I think like we have to really think about what when we're when we're talking about use of these models and access to these models, I think look at the risks and do you want which of these models and what size? Perhaps it is based on like the actual compute used. Is that the threshold that we're going to use, or is it going to be the topic area that it's being used in, right? Is a recommender system going to have completely different regulation than something that's used in medical space, right? Yeah, these are all open questions.
Perhaps if I may come into this one as well, and again, I'm sorry, I hope I'm not muted this time. Good. Yeah, making progress here. Is 2 points. First of all, certainly it's not the intention of the Council of Europe to limit algorithms as such or to regulate the products. The European Union has an initiative that you no doubt have heard of, the AI Act, which is very much an internal market approach. It deals with products and the product safety. Our approach is what governments should do to ensure that their use of AI and what they allow others to do should not interfere with human rights. I mentioned the tragedy in the Netherlands, but you could say, okay, there you have the silly Dutch who got it wrong. But let me give you another example where AI caused victims, and perhaps in this particular area, or at least contributed to a number of deaths. Think about the pandemic. Think about the absolute nonsense about vaccination that was spread on the internet, enhanced through AI systems with regards to the distribution, and how many people chose as a result of the fake news they were given, the disinformation, perhaps more accurately, they're represented with, refrained from getting a vaccination or refrained from having their parents or grandparents vaccinated. And how many deaths has that caused? So think about the polarization in our democracies, which is partly, that's total, it could be the subject of another seminar, the weaponization of social media, but also, of course, algorithms and artificial intelligence there play a role in how disinformation, the scale on which this disinformation is spread, the fact that so many people nowadays, unfortunately, live in filter bubbles, get particular information based on their profile, and the role algorithms have there. So one of the provisions in the treaty, which we hope will be established, will be very much to encourage also the private sector to include human rights and democracy, rule of law considerations already in the design. You've all heard of privacy by design. We'd like to take that a step further, human rights by design, and not just an afterthought. Not just once a system has been developed, say, oh, by the way, yes, this could also have negative effects. Try to have that on board. And another element that was very important, which was mentioned, of course, we'd like to prevent as much harm as we can. But we should also be realistic. Things will still go wrong. With the best of intentions. The Dutch case, actually, I mean, the system was deployed, of course, not with the aim of wreaking havoc. It was to protect system, protect the honest taxpayers, if you like, and people who really needed it. But things will go wrong, and therefore it's so important to have a remedy. I think it is essential that people, first of all, understand they're dealing with AI systems, and that once again there is oversight, competent oversight, and that people have a possibility to a meaningful appeal in these matters, so that when things go wrong, there is a possibility to get it right.
I guess one way to move away from the weaponization and like these malicious things is the democratization of like these algorithms. I know Emma and Divya have both done tremendous work in these fields. I was just wondering, like, what does it mean to democratize, like AI or machine learning in that sense, as a layperson?
It's a big question, right? I don't think we've even agreed on what it means to be a democracy yet. And so it's pretty tough to apply that now to a new technology. And, I think there are some common attributes to what we might include, right, collectively say, in what counts as democratization. So maybe we want some level of voice. I think we would be hard pressed to say that if you can't have input into decision making, then it's democratic. So there's some level of that, right? There's some level of access. that we typically use for the word democratization. If everyone can't access it to some extent, is it really democratic? It's unclear. There's shared benefit of some kind. We're all, equal under the law. There's this idea of political equality and shared benefit. All of these things are still contested by political theorists on what level of them and what amount even counts as a nation-state democracy. And nation-state democracy itself is a very constrained way of thinking about democracy. There are thinkers who look at economic democracy. What does it look like to have a democratic workplace, right? That has a couple of similar things. It has voice. You want to have voice over your workplace, perhaps. You want to be treated equally. You want to share in the benefits. You want to have shared ownership. But it's different. And then you can imagine, what does it look like to have a democratic, say, school? There are school experiments in education where children want to have more voice over education. So we think about democracy differently in different spaces, but there are some common things. And so if we apply that now to technology, I think one thing that Em and I have both talked about is we seem to get rid of most of what's there and kind of just look at access. And it seems like often when we say let's democratize technology, it just means more people can use it, right? And that means we've gotten rid of equal treatment. We've gotten rid of shared ownership. We've gotten rid of voice, and we just focus on access. And sure, that's a piece of it, and we're not saying it isn't. And if only some organizations or some people can access a technology, you can't make the argument that it's democratic. But you don't have a voice over how it's used, if you can't share in its benefits, and if you're not fairly being treated with that technology, then you also can't call it democratic, right? So I think that's the perspective that I at least come from on what it looks like. And then what do you do about it? I mean, one is you take already existing democratic institutions and you apply them to technology. And I think that's one clear way that you can start democratizing tech. A lot of regulatory sort of inputs do this. They take this idea that we already have democratic institutions. So of course, democratization looks like using those. And I think that is a big part of it. It's a great step. But if we look at all the other things that are democratic that we already talked about that aren't nation states, how do we apply those as well, right? How do we apply a more democratic sort of lens to the corporations that build AI? How do we apply a more democratic lens to the platforms that disseminate it? How do we apply, for example, looking at recommendation algorithms? Is there a way to democratize those to regulate their harms? Yes. Is there a way to democratize those that looks like I can choose more of what I get shown in a recommendation algorithm? Yes. Is there a way that people are experimenting with digital juries, for example, to adjudicate misinformation and hate speech? Is that a way to democratize? Also, yes. And so it looks like triangulating all of these different inputs into figuring out, okay, we're really moving forward in a democratic way that is materially shared, where we all get the benefits in addition to curbing the harms and in addition to, applying the nation state lens to it.
Time for questions.
Yes. Now I'm just going to open the floor to audience questions. Anyone? Yes. Good.
Yeah, hi. I have a lot of questions, but I won't do that. Thought-provoking. So I come. Sorry, I don't think I need mic.
You sound great.
It's so Jan can hear you. Yes.
Sorry. Sorry. Hi. I'm interested in the. So I'm a criminal lawyer, and I work at the intersection of tech and penal governance. I'm interested. So most conversations of use of AI in criminal justice has been about risk assessments of violence and crimes. However, the ontology of crime is different in, let's say, Global South, where most crimes are committed by the state. State crimes and even crimes such as sexual violence, most of it is done by state agents. Is there any conversation around use of AI tech for risk assessment of state violence and state crimes? I have a related questions about, on the idea of using regulation as a form of democratizing AI. But it's just sort of like playing a devil's advocate. Do you think that over-regulation is undemocratic? How do we have conversations around disobedience, dissent, disengagement, and balancing desire of using tech and disobedience in our regulatory and post-regulatory work? Because what I feel is that the more we regulate and more we move towards a regulatory framework, we are building more veils of hiding behind. And I was just constantly thinking of the Netherlands incident and wondering whether being an immigrant in that situation had a role to play. Thank you. Sorry.
Fabulous question. I feel like you have great thoughts on this.
Well, I think it did. I think it did have an impact on the, Jan, I think you said, right?
Very much so, yes. They were all from an immigrant background.
Yeah.
All the victims,
Yeah.
sadly. It was very. May I just perhaps kick off a few?
Yep.
If was that, or just a few? And so I think yes, it definitely had an impact, which showed, of course, the bias in the data sets, which took all sorts of elements into account, such as average incomes and living in certain areas, which of course have nothing to do with your likelihood or the likelihood that you are committing fraud. There were data which were completely irrelevant to the question asked, but nonetheless used to answer it. For the treaty we're trying to establish, there's discussion on a number of red lines. You mentioned abuse by authorities. There seems to be consensus amongst at least the 52 states at the table in Strasbourg that, for instance, social scoring, such as used in China, should be totally banned. Is an unacceptable use of AI by the state. Also, that systems, if authorities were to use AI systems to detect people's emotions or infer emotions or gender identity, that all that should also not be allowed. So a number of red lines to be included in the treaty. And that, of course, the principles of oversight, judicial oversight, independent judicial oversight should be maintained. And of course, very important also when it is the state itself that is being challenged, or state agents are being challenged. And that goes for human agents, but also, of course, when the state uses automated systems.
Yeah, to build off of that and answer your question about, okay, so in a lot of our powerful models are in private companies at the moment, right? And perhaps you could be tempted to say, oh, actually, we should not give them that power, and it should be, maybe governments should own these models instead. But of course, you don't necessarily, it depends on your trust in the government, and do you even, essentially what it could do is scale up mass surveillance. It can give power, right? And that power can be wielded in many ways. So those are all really good questions, and I think that's why there aren't some clear-cut solutions sometimes, because you really have to think about, all right, if used in this ideal sense, sure, that works, right? And that's a really great outcome of that use of AI. And then you have to think about malicious use. So if you have an adversarial actor, but also just accidental misuse. So ways that, for example, that was not, like Jan's example, that wasn't a malicious use. That was an accidental, horrible outcome, right? But we do have malicious actors in the world. So yeah, you have to consider all the different attack angles, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Yeah, and briefly on that, I think it's a great point that nation states are not necessarily the best vehicles for democracy and cannot be the only one. I'm from the US, and the only other country I know well and have lived in is India, and I'm not stoked about how democracy is going in either of those places. And do I feel that those governments, if they democratically regulated AI, would do something that I felt was in line with the common good, or at least what people, if they had direct control, would do? No, I don't, right? And I think that's why we need to understand that democracy is not the purview of nation states alone. And that's why things like economic democracy are important. That's why ways to figure out, other global organizations that can themselves be democratic is important. Citizens assemblies are important. And there's really interesting work on scaling them up using technology such that you can actually input. And so you do need countervailing power coming from somewhere, right? And I think the reason we turn to the state often is because we see so much power in private companies, and we're like, what's going to balance that? Well, all we've got is maybe the state. But that's not entirely true. In some cases it is, and in some cases it isn't. Sometimes it's another company, right? Sometimes it's a standards organization. Sometimes it's a social movement. Sometimes it's a global organization. We have to see all of these as in the field of forces of where democracy can come from. And I think relying on the nation state is therefore a mistake, particularly in an age of authoritarianism that we're in.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. This is a fascinating conversation, which I guess the bottom line is it's complicated, and we're moving through this. I wanted, though, to try to pin the panelists down on something a bit more specific about and use analogies to things that are already either regulated or where there's a feature that's developing globally that maybe needs to get more attention. One of them is about CRISPR technology. And CRISPR, of course, is a medical and scientific area on which there are well-established, I hate to use the word regulatory, but procedures that people who are working in CRISPR understand. And that even in China, the Chinese authorities stepped in and stopped a CRISPR experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew to do that, and everybody said, thank goodness, and every university looked at their procedures. Every university worldwide looked at their procedures, and who are we cooperating with in the private sector? Do they have the right procedures? So is CRISPR an analogy to how one might look at, I'm going to say internet governance, but governance of AI? Because again, it seemed to have worked, and there are standards that are layered. Second question is about privacy, because the Americans, and subset California, the European Union, and China all have different privacy mechanisms built into the platforms that are used. But if you are Meta, or if you are LinkedIn, or if you are the about to be late Twitter, you want to operate globally, but you're operating in different jurisdictions that have different views about what's permissible, what is hate speech, what is disinformation. Twitter seems to have forgotten about that. Now that the elections in the United States are over, all those people have disappeared, at least from my feed. So I'm just wondering, are the combinations of platform convergence and other analogous self-governing regulatory and professional behavior going to basically offer a guidance to how to move forward? Thanks.
I could speak on the first one. Okay, CRISPR would be one of several technologies that there would probably be really good points where it would be a good analogy, I think. One really interesting thing to consider when you're looking at that use case is where would be your points for actually validating what's happening. And so one area for AI regulation that people do talk about is compute governance. So actually the fact that you do need a certain level of compute to train these powerful models, that is one step where you can actually validate who is and who is not having access to those, or that level of compute. And for those who are aware, there were some changes in the US to restrict compute to China and things like that. And that is actually motivated by some things of being worried about perhaps things like authoritarianism and other powers that AI could bestow upon governments. I think one other area that people do look at is we control certain weaponry. So for example, nuclear arms, things like that. There are checks and balances and agreements between, treaties between countries. And that is one example where there might be some analogies there. I think also, if you think about it, in terms of trading off the harms versus potential benefits to research and benefits to humanity, I mean, animal research, right? Experiments on mice and things like that, that's hotly contested. And each country has made their own decision about where the trade-off lies between how much animal research can you do for the benefit of maybe curing cancer, right? And these are all trade-offs that we've encountered before, and it would tie into the CRISPR debates. So yeah, I really encourage, especially if you are from any of those areas and this is your area of expertise, really do feel that you can step into this conversation. It's a totally alive conversation that really needs to pull from experience in other areas, things that have been worked out, see what didn't work, right? See where things went wrong. What were the loopholes that people worked around? And what do you wish you did differently? Good questions. But do you guys have anything?
Yeah, super briefly, because I know we're almost at time. I think that's fabulous in the sense that we see that AI governance comes from patching together a bunch of these different things, right? CRISPR is a really great one, but it's slightly easier to track. It's a little bit more, it's less commercialized, so it's not being used in an entirely consumer-facing way, the way a bunch of AI algorithms are. But there's something really useful there. And maybe we can use compute governance or data governance as another layer. What are the inputs to AI that you can govern in a similar way? And then the way we want to bring in internet governance is maybe this is something that's less possible to weaponize as directly, but it is available to everyone. So we can learn something from that because it's more commercialized and it's more consumer facing. Then we can learn from some of these examples we've talked about that are massive infrastructure, right? Like building regulation and things like that, because those come into building massive infrastructure that's publicly owned. Well, there's something we can learn from there. There's something we can learn from a bunch of research norms. So there's publication norms work on AI, for example, of what kinds of models should you open source versus what are dangerous to open source. What are the publication norms around that? The peer review process is something. So I think you pull from the different ways that dangerous things have been both regulated, but I think many of these aren't regulation, right? Publication norms aren't regulation. Peer review, that's not regulation. Mm-hmm. What are standard setting, that's not regulation. So let's triangulate between these ways that technologies have been treated while understanding, like nuclear deterrence, that's not quite regulation, right? And it's not
international relations.
Yeah, so can we triangulate between the ways that we've dealt with things in the past, recognizing that this is different, but it has ingredients of all of those. And I think that's a really great point.
Just a few points, to add. A question about different jurisdictions, absolutely true. But the example of the Cybercrime Convention I mentioned, where, as I said, in the past year we were in 130 countries, gives an idea that you can reach a large global consensus on some key issues. Admittedly, not the whole world, but we know there are regimes, there are authoritarian regimes that will never subscribe or respect any human rights standards as we understand it. What we can do is try to build a coalition as large as possible of everyone who is willing to subscribe to certain standards. And as I said, with regards to cybercrime, that is proceeding well. Of course, we can always regard the glass as half full or half empty. We always point out the missing jurisdictions, of course. But I think 130 countries out of the sort of 200 we have in the world is already a fairly, definitely a step in the right direction. And if we could get a buy-in into this AI treaty, which is what we called AI and human rights, if that were to be adhered to by 130 countries, I'd sign immediately, I must say, on the dotted line for that, because I think that would be really, really very encouraging. Then on the regulations, the medical field was mentioned. Perhaps we can extend it a bit. Think about the pharmaceutical industry, the testing of products. In our treaty, we very much propose, or the draft treaty so far, propose regulatory sandboxes that before systems are rolled out, before governments, for instance, decide to use them. Think about the Dutch example. Had that system been properly tested in a regulatory sandbox, this whole tragedy may not have occurred. So test your stuff before you roll it out. There was also, that's another remark I'd like to make to end with regard to the pharmaceutical industry. I must admit we've had some pushback with regards to our efforts to come up with a comprehensive global treaty from not so much from governments, but from certain actors within government. And also some companies, perhaps, notably as regards governments, ministries of economic affairs, who fear that any form of regulation would hamper innovation. But I don't think that's true. I think good regulation will foster good innovation. And there again, I would take the pharmaceutical industry. It is the most tightly regulated industry in the world. Yet it produced vaccines against COVID in no time, to give just an example, and many other fantastic medicine as well. So I think the two really can go together.
Thank you. We'll just have time for one more question after lunch. Yes.
I'll just speak out. So I work in a public cloud organization, and I work on a range of customers with AI and ML wanting to use. Sorry, I'll just start again. So I work in a public cloud organization, and I work with a range of customers wanting to use our AI and ML tools, and we say that we democratize AI and ML. But I think a really good intersection between regulation and actually, deciding what a good future looks like is public cloud, because that's essentially what a lot of people are using to get into those spaces, to be competitive with those big companies that have all these resources. And you've mentioned compute are things that public cloud makes accessible to if you have a computer and an internet connection. So my question is, what role do you think that public cloud has to make in terms of helping create whatever our definition is of a democratized future?
I have something to say. Okay, yeah, okay. That is an excellent question. And I think depending on which kind of levels of algorithms we're talking about, there's kind of different answers with that. I think actually cloud providers have a huge responsibility, because with more compute comes more responsibility, because you have more power, roughly, with the way that models are scaling right now. And I think there is maybe some discussion about checks and balances. See what kind of what are the models being used for? What's actually their intention, and do you approve of that use? Right? I think. Do we need to allow anyone ever to make any model that they want? I actually don't think that that's a good democratic future, right? Maybe there does need to be some consensus around, like, yeah, that does seem like a good thing to train. I mean, similarly, these things take data, and at the moment, we're not really having that much say over how our data is used by a lot of these companies. Maybe we should have some sort of mechanism, but when my data is being used to train certain algorithm, that I say, yeah, okay, you can train for that, or no, I don't agree with that use. So yeah, I think because there's so much power in that position, I think it's a really important place to be thinking about use of small models, right? Like in research and these tinier predictive models, but also for like the very large language models, the generative models. I think we're in a new world with that. Yeah, and I mean, also, if for example, the U.S. is actually taking actions to restrict compute to other places, does that become a human, they do it kind of in the name of human rights? But I think that there is also a question of, is it then a human rights issue that certain types of compute? It's only the really, really advanced compute that even applied to. But yeah, I think cloud providers are going to play a huge role. And who knows, maybe regulation will come into those organizations. It's just all up in the air.
May I add something with regard to cloud computing? I fully agree with what you said on the something which has not been discussed also far today is the environmental impact. Of course, we know that in Sharm el-Sheikh, as we speak, the COP is taking place. We will have, hopefully in our treaty, a commitment by states to also assess the environmental impact of the systems they use, and also of the training. And that's, of course, and you will excuse me that, of course, I make the link with clouds there, but you'll see why. Because in our view, it is a question to be asked in addition to your human rights impact assessment. What effect will this system have, or the use of this system have on our citizens? Sorry. But another question to be asked is the cake worth the candle? Is the enormous amount of energy that is required to train certain models desirable if, for instance, the increase in accuracy is 0.000 whatever? If it's a very, very small increase in accuracy worth training at huge expense, and let's be honest, expense to the environment as well. Is that worth it? In some cases, yes, no doubt. It can save lives, whatever. But it is a question, I think, that could be asked, that should be asked, and that is perhaps often overlooked in our discussions on AI.
I know everyone's getting a bit hungry, and so I know you wanted to hear more, so you can talk to the panelists during lunch, which will be right after that. It's on the 3rd floor, and so let's just give a hand to everyone. Thank you.